Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Russ Boyer. I'm a storage solution architect here at AWS. I am going to talk to you today about some of the best practices for securing your AWS Transfer Family servers. I have along with me Jeff Bartley, who is also a solution architect focusing on storage here at AWS. So today's activity is all about learning more about the AWS Transfer Family. We're going to cover a little bit about how the Transfer Family works, and then I'm going to pivot into a workshop where we'll demonstrate the Transfer Family, including we're going to learn today about IP whitelisting, which is a way of securing your endpoints and preventing unwanted access. We're also going to learn about logical directories, which is a way that you can secure your users into specific directories inside of your S3 buckets. At the end, we'll come back to this presentation and we'll wrap up. I do want to mention up front that this is part of a series of virtual workshops that we'll be hosting over the next coming weeks. Today is the first of those virtual workshops, and we'll talk more about what's coming at the end of the presentation. So what is AWS Transfer Family? Well, ultimately, AWS Transfer Family allows you to use a fully managed and fully supported service that uses SFTP, FTPS, and FTP in order to get data in and out of Amazon S3. This is particularly useful for customers that need to interface with third parties and don't want to grant access directly to their S3 buckets. It's also particularly useful for customers who want to distribute data out to customers or perhaps partner entities. We see a lot of uptake in financial services and healthcare where secure transfer is extremely important. And then also we see uptake on other areas, including application workflows, such as data lakes, where you can use these standard protocols that are supported by many different systems in order to get your data in and out of Amazon S3 without necessarily having to rewrite your applications to use S3 APIs, for example. Before the Transfer Family came along, a customer would be required to potentially house their SFTP infrastructure or managed file transfer infrastructure inside of their own data center or in the cloud. And that might require building failover models, scaling models, and upkeep on hardware, as well as software renewal costs. With Transfer, we eliminate the need for doing all of that. Transfer Family is a fully managed service. It does land your data into S3. Additionally, we can support custom identity providers in the service, as well as the service itself has what we call service managed users. That's what we'll be doing today. But if you need to use a custom identity provider, it's absolutely available by using API Gateway and Lambda. The data lands in S3, and that's particularly useful for customers who want to use additional services on top of S3, such as Redshift or EMR, to do data warehousing or perhaps to do some analytics. How do you get started with Transfer? Well, I'll be showing you that today, but I do want to make sure and point out that as easy as 1, 2, 3, we're going to deploy a server endpoint. As we do that, we'll be configuring users, and we'll be pointing those users at particular S3 buckets. Transfer Family has very transparent pricing. You're paying 30 cents per hour per protocol, plus the cost of downloads and uploads. So it's all spelled out very clearly up front. The workshop that we're going to do today is divided into 4 modules. In Module 1, we're going to deploy a CloudFormation template that's going to establish a VPC and a few other things for us. We'll walk through that. In Module 2, we're going to create a basic user and do some testing in our environment. At this point, we'll be learning a little more about IP whitelisting. In Module 3, we're going to learn how to create an organizational user structure where we utilize logical directories to prevent unwanted access of our users to areas that we would prefer that they not go, and also perhaps to even create landing zones where shared data could be landed. So, and then at the end, very important, we're going to clean up after the workshop. I do want to make the point that running this workshop in your own environment should cost less than $5 as long as you clean up after yourself immediately when you're done. And I'll show you how to do that before we wrap up today. So I'm going to take this workshop links. Hopefully we can get those into the chat for anybody who might want to follow along at home. But this is the full link to the workshop. It's out on GitHub. Anybody should be able to reach it. In addition, we have this bit.ly link as a URL shortener. And hopefully that will make it easier to get over. I'm going to leave this up for just a few seconds before we step over into the workshop itself. If you've never done one of our GitHub workshops, they're pretty easy to follow along. There's some screenshots. There's an entire script to follow along, including laying out a scenario. The scenario in this case is that we are saying that you've decided after some research to use AWS Transfer Family to receive data from your business partners via SFTP, and that's going to allow your data to flow through an encrypted protocol in flight, and that's also going to allow you to accept regulatory information. Perhaps this could be PHI, perhaps this could be financially regulated information. So let's move into the workshop and get started. There we go. All right. So in Module 1, you'll see that we're going to use CloudFormation to deploy a working environment. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this CloudFormation template in US East 1. One tip along the way, if you hold down Control when you click these links, it will launch those in a new tab. Might make it a little easier for you. So when we get into the CloudFormation deployment, in this particular case, it's calling this CloudFormation template from a bucket that we hosted in. And we don't have to do anything special on this page. I've already filled in a stack name on your behalf. Hopefully it will be unique. You could change this to be something else if you wanted it to be, but it'll be supplied for you. Click Next here. In Configure Stack Options, we really don't need to change anything on this page, but as you can see, there'd be a lot of potential options for you. We're going to click Next, and then we're going to review. And as we review, we can see where we're pulling the CloudFormation template from. We can see what the stack description is. And if we scroll down, we'll see that we actually need to check this box. This box is acknowledging that CloudFormation is going to create some IAM resources. That's important. We want to make sure that our customers understand when they're going to deploy a template that might have potential security ramifications, such as creating new IAM roles or policies. And we want to make sure you're aware of that when you deploy. We're going to go ahead and create the stack. So this is going to take a few minutes. And if you go to the Resources tab, you can start refreshing. You'll see it's starting to do some creates along the way. We're creating S3 buckets here. We're creating some IAM roles. We're creating a new VPC so that this entire workshop will stand alone inside of its own VPC. We're doing an internet gateway to that VPC because we do need to be able to reach this VPC from the public internet. And as you can see along the way, it'll go create complete on several of these. I actually have a pre-deployed version of this so that we can go look and see once your resources have all deployed, what you can expect to see here. So this one is all complete. And if we go to the Outputs tab, this information is going to be particularly useful for you as you step through the workshop. You will need bits and pieces of this along the way. So I would suggest perhaps just leaving this open in a separate tab. What's going to be particularly important are these elastic IPs, these IAM roles, as well as the bucket names. All right, so let's go back and check on our other CloudFormation deployment, and we can see that it has completed deployment. And if we go to the outputs here, we can see that we have indeed created all those same bits and pieces along the way. All right, let's go and create a transfer family server. So in this particular
Jeff,
region,
I've got a quick question for you.
All right.
Hey, so do customers always need to use CloudFormation templates to deploy AWS Transfer Family servers, or can they do that manually?
They can absolutely do that manually. Yes. I am using a CloudFormation template here for a couple of reasons. One, it's automated, and in the span of demonstrating the workshop, don't want to have to necessarily walk you through all the little bits and pieces of creating new VPCs. But if you already have those pieces pre-created and you just want to stand up a transfer server inside of your existing environment, you could absolutely do that without using a CloudFormation template. In fact, this particular CloudFormation template doesn't actually deploy the transfer server itself. We're going to do that now as a separate piece, just so you can see how easy it is to do that. So let's go ahead and create a server. And when we create this server, we're going to just check, in this case, SFTP, but as you can see, we could support FTPS. Also, we support FTP, but an important note about FTP, we do not support FTP for external communications, so you'd only be able to use internal IP addresses with FTP. And that is because FTP does a lot of clear text transmission and non-encrypted file transfers. So we don't want you using that to interface with external entities due to security concerns. But you can absolutely host FTP inside of your VPC, and that is particularly useful for legacy workloads where you might be relying on FTP as part of your application stack. So we're going to go with SFTP. And in this case, we're going to have service managed users. So here is our choice where we can go with a publicly accessible endpoint. A publicly accessible endpoint would just create a new endpoint, would not be inside of your VPC. It would just be publicly accessible over the internet. In this case, we want our SFTP server to be accessible via the internet, but we want to control who's going to be able to access it. So we're going to go with a VPC hosted endpoint, and we are going to say that that's internet facing. As you can see, we could do a custom host name here. We're not going to do that as a part of today's workshop, but this would be a great option for you if you're migrating in from another service or from on-premises. You could bring that host name with you so that your end users would not experience any disruption. We're going to go ahead, and this is where we need to be able to go back and look at our CloudFormation outputs. So let's go back to our CloudFormation output. And in this case, we want to go look at the CloudFormation output in US East. We'll look at the resources it created, and we want to find what VPC is associated. So in this case, it ends in 43DC. So if we go back here to our transfer server, we'll select the appropriate VPC. And in that VPC, we only created subnets in 2 availability zones. The important note here is you can do up to 3 availability zones, and this allows you to build availability zone tolerance in the event of an availability zone outage. You would still be able to reach the service. We're only going to do 2 today, but you can do up to 3. as you check the box, you select your subnet, and then you'll need one of your elastic IPs. So let's, again, step back to our CloudFormation output. And we see this 52.86 elastic IP. So we're going to go ahead and select that. Then we're going to check the box for our second subnet. We're going to go ahead and select that. And we're going to, once again, 75.101. So what this is doing is this is creating a binding or a relationship between one of our internal IPs and this external IP. That's going to allow the service to host a publicly accessible endpoint that actually ultimately exists inside of your VPC, which is important for security. Another note, here we're going to allow CloudWatch to create a new role. And we're going to just go ahead and accept the defaults here. For server host key, I want to make another important point. You could bring your server's host key if you were trying to do a seamless transition in from another service or perhaps on premises. You could even bring your key in so that your users would not have to accept a new key. Good for seamless transitions. We're going to leave everything on this page at default, and we're going to click Next. Then we're going to go ahead and create the server. So this does take a few minutes, could take 5 to even 10 minutes depending on what you have going on and the amount of latency between you and the region. So we're going to actually go ahead with a transfer server that I pre-created for today's activity. And we're going to roll forward in the workshop. So at this point, we have our transfer server online. And let's go in and look at that server. You'll see this server has no users. So we want to test this server, but before we can test it, we are going to need to create a user. So this is in the workshop, but we're going to go ahead and create a user called standard. And let's go here to add user. And when we do that, we need to choose a role. And you may remember our CloudFormation template created a role on our behalf. It actually created 3 roles. Let's go take a look at that. And as you can see, we have a role here. This role actually grants access to bucket 1. Then we have another role here that grants access to bucket 2. And then you'll notice I created an all role, and we'll talk about that more a little later in the workshop. For now, we're going to use the one associated with bucket 1. So that's this S3 bucket 1 IAM role that ends in FI2F. So here it is. And as far as the scope down policy, we're not going to cover that today. We're not going to do that. We're not going to choose a home directory because I want you to see what that looks like. We do need to supply an SSH public key. So SFTP with transfer uses standard public-private key pair. And so we'll need access to a public-private key pair. And this, we're going to go ahead and look at our public key here. We're going to copy that. And we're just going to paste it right in. And then we're going to add our user. So now we have added a test user to use with this particular endpoint. You'll see this is our DNS name here for our endpoint. So let's go and actually try to connect to that. I'm using CyberDuck. You may be able to use WinSCP or command line SFTP. In this case, I'm using CyberDuck. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new connection. And I'm going to use the username as standard. And you can see here, because I've been doing some testing, that I've already selected the private key associated with demo key. I'm going to go ahead and connect. So you may not be able to see it. It may be kind of hard to see, but it's trying to connect to this SFTP server. And at the moment, it's not able to. It's not connecting. So we must have, oh, I know what's going on. So we need to go and actually allow my IP address to be able to access this particular endpoint. So the best and easiest way I have found to get to the security group for my endpoint, so I'm actually going to go right here and I'm going to control click on that link, which is going to open this VPC endpoint in the VPC management console. And you'll see here we have security groups. Under security groups, we have a group ID selected. Let's go look at the settings for that security group. So on this security group, we have some tabs we can try. So that actually, I'll pull this up. Our connection did fail. So we're going to cancel out. That was our CyberDuck connection failing. It did time out eventually. So let's go in here in inbound rules. As you can see right now, the security group is set at the moment to only accept traffic that comes from within itself. So let's add an inbound rule. In this case, we can select SSH here. So that's going to open the appropriate port since SSH and SFTP use the same port. Under source, let's go ahead and use my IP. It'll automatically fill in the IP that you're hitting the console from, and we can save the rule. So now we've created a new inbound rule for port 22 and my IP address today. And let's go back into CyberDuck and let's try to connect again. All right, so now it's our first time connecting to this server. So we're actually going to need to accept the RSA key. I'm going to go ahead and check the box for always, and I'm going to go ahead and allow that RSA key. Choose the right private key. All right, well, let's see. I'm a little bit of trouble with this one. Let's go back here. Okay, I must have done something wrong along the way. Let's go check on the key that I used when I created my user. Oh, I know what I did. I think I have solved the problem. I'm trying to connect to the wrong place. So let's go back to our transfer server. By the way, I did want to highlight our transfer server in Northern Virginia did eventually finish connecting. So we close that tab. And then let's go ahead and revisit. Close this tab. Go ahead and close this tab as well, just so I'm not in the wrong place, which is what happened before. All right, let's go here. And let's delete this user. Let's re-add this user. Let's make sure that I'm selecting the right S3 bucket for our particular region. Right? Gonna grab our key again. And let's go back and try to open this connection one more time. All right. Well, having trouble with this particular user, let's actually move away from this part. We'll try to test with a different user. All right. Now that we can reach our transfer server, let's move into the part of the workshop where we actually go ahead and create some organizational users along the way. So for those following along, this will be Module 3. In Module 3, you'll see that I've created a matrix of accounts. So this would be all about trying to emulate what you might find in a real company, where we're going to have some users who need to be able to access individual accounts and perhaps a common landing area for sharing files externally. You have some users coming in, they're going to need to be able to access different data. This is going to represent data that has had some sort of application workflow applied to it. We're going to have one user in this particular case who is a full admin user, and this particular user is going to have access to everything. So we're going to go through the process of creating these, but before we do, we're going to actually want to go into S3 and pre-create our folders. So let's go. We've got our bucket 1 and we've got our bucket 2. Let's look at where each folder lives. So for bucket 1, we're going to need 3 folders, one for user 1, one for user 2, and one for common. So let's go into bucket 1 and let's create a folder. And let's call that folder user 1. Let's create another folder called user 2. And then let's create a folder called common. Then if we go back to our matrix of folders that we need to create, we've got this raw data and process data folder that we're creating in bucket 2. So let's go back here into our S3 console, and let's go into bucket 2. Let's create a couple of folders here as well. So now we've created our entire folder structure. All right, so what do we need to do to create these users that we're going to put into logical directories? let's go ahead and for this, we're going to have to use the command line. The command line is the way which we create users who are going to need logical directories. So I actually am going to do that from a Linux machine that I use as a script host. And I've got some bash scripts that I've created that'll help me create the users that I want to create. Before we step into that, let me look at one more thing. Make sure my server is online and healthy. All right, so let's go ahead and let's create our first user. So I have this script here. And this script is going to go ahead and it's going to create, using our role that our CloudFormation template created on our behalf, it's going to go ahead and supply the role. We've got a few mapping entries. So what we're doing is we're mapping user 1 to this bucket and this subfolder. We're mapping a directory called user1 temp to this bucket and this subfolder. And then we're going to go ahead and call this command, which is going to create our user with the mappings that we specified. And then we're going to call this command, which is going to import our public key as well for that user. So let's go ahead. We will need to go ahead and copy our transfer server name. As we execute this, we will supply that as a variable. All right, so we've created our user against our server. Now let's go back and see what happened in the console. So we see that we do have a user 1 created here. And if we click on user 1, we're going to see that the home directory shows up here as restricted. So let's view what that looks like. So here are our mappings that we created. These are our logical directories. So let's log in as this user. Go back here, actually. Let's grab our endpoint's full host name. And we'll see as we log in as this user, we do have access here to user 1 and user 1 temp. So the interesting thing about this is user 1 temp is a logical directory that maps back to the folder we created called common. But in this case, user 1, they see that as user 1 temp. So logical directory not only allows us to lock a user into specific folders, it allows us to create essentially a mapping that will obscure the name of the real folder inside of the bucket from the end user. So let's copy some files in as a test. So I have some test files here. I've pre-created just test file 1 through 5. These are just text documents. We'll go ahead and go into the user 1 directory and we'll pull in test file 1. So it's going to go ahead and upload this file. And once it's uploaded, let's actually go back to the console and go to S3 and let's see what we have here. So if we go into S3 and we go into Workshop Bucket 1 and we go into User 1, we'll see there's our test file. So now we have used SFTP to upload a file successfully into S3. So let's again as user 1, let's go in and let's go up a directory and let's put a file in user 1 temp. We'll go ahead and use test file 2. It does take a second to
Russ,
upload.
so this is pretty cool. Hey, Russ, this is Jeff. So this is pretty cool. You've shown us how to authenticate using SSH keys, but sometimes, our customers will have users that need to use password authentication. Does AWS Transfer Family allow for that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So you can do password-based authentication if you use a third-party identity provider. There's some blog posts and other useful information in the documentation as well. But yes, with the use of a third-party identity provider, we can absolutely support password-based authentication or even multi-factor authentication.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and post a link to one of our blogs that talks about that in the chat area. Thanks, Russ.
All right, great. So now I've uploaded a file into user 1 temp, and we can see here that test file 2 is actually in the common directory in our bucket. So let's go ahead and create user 2. Open my console back up. And as we're creating user 2, I just want to point out that the script is, in this case, calling the same role because user 2 does, in fact, have all of their folders in bucket 1. I want to point out, though, for user 2, they're going to get mapped to user 2, which is the user 2 folder. And I've got user 2 temp, in this case, mapped back to the same common folder. So let's create this user. Go ahead and copy my transfer server's name to supply with my script. All right, so we've created our second user. Let's go back to CyberDuck. In this case, I'm going to get rid of this upload window, and let's open a connection to our server as user 2. So as user 2, we see user 2 and we see user 2 temp. And if we go into user 2, of course, there's nothing there. We've never uploaded anything there. And if we go into user 2 temp, well, there's the file, test file 2, that we uploaded as user 1. So this is useful if you're trying to create a logical directory structure that supports your end users being able to share files with each other. You could dump those off into a common folder like we're doing here. And now both users are able to access those files. However, they see those directories with different names. So that can be useful. And then let's go in as user 2 and let's upload a file. We'll just go ahead and do test file 3 here. All right, and if we step back out to S3 and we go into the user 2 directory, we'll see test file 3. So we've been successful here. So let's go ahead and create our regulator user. And you'll see in the script for creating our regulator user, I am actually calling the bucket 2 role. And this is because regulators folders all live in bucket 2. I'm going to map a raw data folder, which is just mapped right to the raw data folder in the bucket. And I'm going to map a processed folder, which is going to be mapped to the processed folder in the bucket. So it's all pretty simple. So let's go ahead. And let's create our regulator user. Then we'll log in as our regulator user. And as regulator, you see we have raw data and we have processed, both of which are empty. We'll go ahead and we'll use test file 4 in our raw data directory. An important note is you can set up application workflows that are triggered by things like S3 put events. So you could have a Lambda function be triggered by these uploads to actually go out and perhaps do some processing of a file. That can be really useful. You could have the file come in, it lands in the raw data folder, and then you could have an S3 put event trigger that has a Lambda fire off, and that might go out and do some sort of data transformation, and then it can land that file back into the processed folder. So in this case, we don't have anything downstream doing that. So we'll just go ahead and load into the processed folder another test file. And then we see our queue processing, and we're authenticating, and we've uploaded test file 5. So we'll go back to S3 one more time. And we will look in the bucket 2. And if we go into raw data, we'll see test file 4. And if we go into processed, we'll see test file 5. All right, so this has all been fairly simple so far for one-to-one mappings or even one-to-many mappings, such as our common folder. But how about if we want to create an administrative user who is a super user that has access to view all the folders? That's what we'll be doing in this next step. So in this case, you're going to see that I'm calling a different role. And let's actually go into the console and let's take a look at that role. So if we go to services, we can go to IAM. And we can go to roles. In this case, I used transfer in the name of the role, so it's easy. We can just search here for it. And we're going to go look at the bucket all role. And if we look at the attached policy to bucket all, we see that in this case, it's probably not a security best practice. I did allow full access, but that's because I plan to delete all of this as soon as we're done. You could selectively allow via resources, the ability under action, we've done all, but you could have a read-only role. You could have a write-only role. And there are all kinds of things you can do here. In this case, we're doing all actions. We're just allowing full access to the bucket for the end users. But you'll see here that I actually have both buckets supplied. I want to make one other point as we're looking at roles that we use for transfer. We do have to establish a trust relationship between the role itself and transfer. So this allows the transfer service to act on behalf of the user once the user has logged in. And you can view that and see that it's just a simple, this is all covered in the transfer documentation, but I did want to show you that this is necessary. So you not only need the role, you do need the trust as well. So we have our role, we have our trust. So this particular role allows us to create the super user that has access to both buckets. So now we will go back to our console connection. And we'll look at this again. So we're mapping here 5 entries. So it's just an entry per particular. And you'll notice for the super user, I'm going to go ahead and let them see that the name of the directory is common. So I'm going to use the same name. And you'll see that these 2 mappings actually contain the folders that exist in the second bucket. So let's run this. Go ahead and recopy the name of my transfer server. And let's run this. All right, we've created our admin user. Let's go and connect with CyberDuck. So once we've authenticated as our admin user, now we can see that we actually can see all the directories here. And if we expand, we'll see that we can see all the files. So now we have all of our test files visible. We can get into all these directories. And as this super user, we could do something. We could even go ahead and potentially delete the file in common if we decided that perhaps it was inappropriate for it to be there. We can just go delete that. And if we go back into S3, we'll see in bucket 1, under common, let's go ahead and refresh that. And we'll see that our object is no longer there. All right, so that has been a demonstration of how you might be able to create this matrix. You could obviously automate this to the point that you wanted to. You could feed all of those different buckets and roles in as a CSV file, and you could write a shell script that knew how to handle creating the different mappings of the CSV file. I mean, there's a lot of different options for what you can do. So now we have completed the creation and testing phase. I do want to walk you through quickly how to go ahead and clean up this particular workshop so that you don't incur any additional costs after you run it. So let's go to Module 4. Module 4 does walk you through how to clean up from this workshop. So the first piece we have to do is we absolutely have to clean up inside of our S3 buckets. The reason we have to do that is when we go to delete our CloudFormation template, you're not able to delete a bucket that actually contains objects. It's just there as additional security to prevent you from having an oops along the way. I'm going to go ahead and force delete all these folders as an admin user, and then I'm going to do the same thing in bucket 2. As well. Just real quickly, interestingly enough, so now I've deleted the folders. What would happen as our admin user now if we logged back in? So let's refresh this. And you can see we just see nothing here. So essentially, our mappings disappear unless our folder structure is there. So that's an important point. You want to make sure that your folder structure is in place before your users log in. Otherwise, they will not see anything when they log in. All right, we can get out of CyberDuck for now. We'll go ahead and disconnect, and we'll close that out. And then let's go ahead and step into deleting our transfer server itself. So let's go to servers, and let's click here. And let's go ahead and stop our transfer server. It does take a few seconds to stop, but not super long. All right, now that our transfer server has been stopped, we're going to go ahead and delete it as well. You do have to type delete as a confirmation here. All right, and now let's go back and let's clean up after ourselves in our CloudFormation stack. So you'll notice, actually, if you're in stacks, you can click the radio button here and you can click delete, and that'll certainly delete the stack. In this particular case, I'm going to go into the stack, and I like to pull up the resources tab. So here's all the resources our CloudFormation template created for us. I'm going to go ahead and click delete here, and I'm going to delete the stack. And then you're going to see it will kick off a delete step for each of these resources along the way. I'll take a few seconds to go through. There's some dependencies, so it does delete things in the opposite order of the way that they were created. But when this is done, actually, the stack will disappear completely from your stacks console. So that is how you effectively clean up after this workshop. So after you have done that, your buckets will be gone. Your transfer server will be gone, so you'll no longer be incurring any of the charges associated with those two. And we've also cleaned up all those IAM roles and IAM policies along the way. So let's go back to our presentation. All right, so I hope that you've seen today that the transfer family service is simple to deploy. In just an hour's time, not only have we deployed a transfer server, we've created an entire organization of users. We've also created logical directory mappings in those organizations to grant those users specific access to specific resources. And we've done that while using VPC endpoints. VPC endpoints are the extremely important piece for controlling who can access your endpoint by using that IP whitelisting. That was that security group that we updated earlier. And I just want to make sure that your other takeaway is that logical directories really give you the ability to securely service your users without having to necessarily create a whole bunch of different S3 IAM roles and policies. So if you want to learn more about the transfer family, there's several links here. We can also share these in the chat. Of course, there's the landing page for the transfer family service itself. We've got some workshops out here, that, including this one, that you can run from GitHub. And then there are some videos that will walk you through the concepts that we discussed today and some other concepts as well. I did want to come back and make sure I make the point that this is a series of workshops. Today was the first one. On Wednesday of this week, we will be having migrating from on-premises file servers to AWS hybrid cloud storage. On Friday of this week, we're going to automate EBS snapshots. And then next week, we will be covering scaling and simplifying Windows file storage with FSX, S3 security, as well as how to use our AWS backup with our cross-account management feature. Additionally, if you want to learn more about other AWS services, including storage or other services outside of storage, you might want to visit this URL, which will take you to an area where you can learn about all the different training that's out there. This one will be storage specific, but the training URL has other services as well. I want to thank you for joining today. That concludes our virtual workshop.